Good morning. This is Seraphim Hennish, American in Exile, 1967. And today is February the 9th. And we are going to talk about the interview with Tucker Carlson and President Vladimir Putin. This interview was aired at 2 a.m. Moscow time, 6 p.m. New York time. Correspondingly, that would be 6 p.m. Thursday evening, New York time. And when I did not stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning in hopes of watching the interview, but I was up around 6:30 and I got to take a look at it. And more than that, I watched the entire thing and actually have a piece up on the Duran with a full transcript of the interview. With some edits. It's primarily from the Kremlin website, but there were a few mistakes that the English translators for the Kremlin website made, largely just minor linguistic niggles because Tucker Carlson's vocalizations sometimes and his pronunciation of some things probably got past the translators and they didn't handle it correctly. But most of it, there are also one or two things from what President Putin said that were not as clear as they could have been. I don't think anything that I made edits with substantially changes the message or information that is presented in the interview, but reproducing it a little bit closer to exactly what was said seems to sort of enrich it a little bit. And so I'm planning as soon as possible to send my revisions to the Kremlin website editors in hopes that they might find it useful. It sounds like a rather grandiose thing to do. And I don't expect that they will actually accept my edits, but, I have the freedom to try. So I'm going to try. Anyway, the interview, there are two parts to this that we need to talk about. One is the interview itself, and two is the challenges that it will find, and no doubt did find, in the audiences to which it was intended. The first part I want to cover rather briefly is the interview itself. I'll show you some of the transcripted stuff and you'll see some video frames and stuff as I'm talking. But the interview basically had probably about 4 parts. The first part was a rather lengthy historical rundown, which Tucker mentions himself in the beginning, was somewhat, he didn't understand what to make of this. He thought that President Putin was trying to filibuster. That's what he says in the beginning of his own report. He himself offered very little commentary, but he just makes a note of this. Said that President Putin offered a lengthy description of the history of the region. And at first, Tucker thought it was sort of a clever filibuster and tried to interrupt him a few times because he got a little annoyed with it. And President Putin was also a little bit, he really wanted to make his point. And so, and he got to say everything that he needed to say. In retrospect, Tucker thought that he made his historical review for a reason. This is going to be something I'll touch on more later, but I think this actually plays to or addresses the issue that was being brought up as part of the narrative pre-interview about this, that to say, as somebody put it, no matter what President Putin talks, he's going to talk about propaganda points. And this sentence became the rather brief-lived traveling mantra that started to flow across several different commentators from several different places before the interview. And I think this is very regrettable, but I'll try to hold off on that part until the second part, because that's where we need to address this. So the first part of the interview is very detailed, very lengthy, talking about the creation of the Russian state in the 9th century, leading up to the situation of World War II. And some of the stuff that I already knew, like I already knew, for example, that the word Ukrainian or the word Ukraine itself is an old word meaning borderland. And the idea is basically a Ukrainian is a person who lives on the border. And this was to answer on the border of what? It was on the border of Rus, okay? As Rus existed in its early inceptions from the 9th century and later after the time of Genghis Khan and the Mongol horde, the Golden Horde, as the Russian state began to reconstitute itself with its center of power in Moscow instead of Kiev and Novgorod. So President Putin talked also at this point at length about an idea that seems to have had its beginning a very, very long time ago, according to the president, at least as far back as the year 1654, where some of the people, the Polish people, started, they actually treated the borderland people rather poorly. But apparently, according to President Putin, they were talking about trying to convince these people slowly that they were their own unique ethnicity. Now, this actually went into increased strength before World War I, according to the president, and this idea of what is now called Ukrainization, which is the idea that these people have a distinct cultural and national identity that is apart from and different from that of the Russian Empire or the Russian Lithuanian Duchy. So he talks at length about this idea and how this idea of Ukrainization continued through World War II and was re-amplified after the Soviet Union fell in 1991, and Ukraine at that point retained its borders as defined by Soviet Union edict. It was quite a bit larger than it used to be and quite a bit further to the east than it used to be. But nevertheless, these land borders were maintained by agreement on the behalf of the parties dealing with the breakup of the and dissolution of the Soviet Union. And President Putin also talked about this in a very different light. This was probably my first real big surprise. And that was that President Putin talks about Boris Yeltsin as being basically very maligned by popular history in the West as a useless alcoholic and so on. Yet President Putin indicated that Yeltsin was quite a bit more capable than that, and this would probably be not in some small part because it was Yeltsin himself who handpicked Putin to be his successor when he resigned. Okay, so the first part of the interview concerned itself with this early Russian history period, and then the second part begins, it still was on history, but it carried us into the First and Second World Wars, and actually a little bit before that, the creation of the Soviet Union itself, and the assignment of lands to the Soviet of Ukraine. And so, and there was just an exhaustive rundown of all of the history that surrounds this. And in particular, the focus was on the fact that this idea that the Ukrainian people have a particular national identity that is distinct from the Russians is false. it is something that is, this seemed to me a little bit difficult to accept. It seemed a little difficult to believe that the campaign that has been warping the thoughts and minds of Ukrainian people since the late 1990s and into this century is something that was actually also practiced hundreds of years ago. But here is the thing. In our country, in the United States, we don't have such a long history. We have a 250-year history, not even, but just about 250 years of history as a nation. 2026 would be 250 years. And we also don't have the kind of rubbing of elbows in the same way as the European states do and did with one another. So in a place that was essentially running a European civilization for close to even 1,000 years before Russia itself was begun, then I guess there are certainly a lot of room. There's certainly a lot of room for palace intrigues of various types, and people pushing on each other all the time, and trying to convince this group of this and that group of that. And if you look at European history, it's full of wars of these little groups against one another. Now, in our history, as colonizers in the North American continent, the United States and Canada and Mexico were Europeans bringing a completely different way of life onto a continent that was certainly not without its own problems and conflicts, but it was very, very different. It was like night and day, to deal with the American Indians as a well-armed, rather technologically advanced European army against people that didn't even have horses at the beginning, let alone guns or anything like that. So it's a very different context. And because it's such a different context, it doesn't exist in our history. And it is a challenge for us to accept it and relate to it because we can't. Okay, we can't even do it with the American Civil War because the idea there was never that there was a culturally different America. It was more about a certain part of the United States wishing to do things the way that they wished to do them, and seceding from the northern part of the United States, from the whole country, really, because they wanted to go on doing the things that they were doing, not because of national or cultural identity, but because of their wishes to pursue their own particular policies. So this is all very different for us. And I think it was probably different for Tucker Carlson himself to hear it, because it's one thing to be a student of history, and it is another thing to come to realize that history actually really has long-reaching effects, centuries and centuries of effect on the people that whose families took part in it. So let's take President Putin at his word when he talks about this, because he is a product of that kind of culture and society. And even in his own story, a very interesting story about going to a place in the Ukrainian Soviet where there were Hungarians that were living as ethnic Hungarians within the borders of the Ukrainian SSR. They were preserving their national identity, their culture, their language, their customs, all of that kind of stuff, because it mattered to them. I mean, we might see that here and there in the United States. We might see it with the Amish, for example. We might see it a little bit with the preservation of the Western, the Southwestern and Western cowboy and ranching culture, such as it is. Certainly we do that. But we have very, very little depth compared to what I'm talking about here and what President Putin was talking about in the interview. And I think that just needs to be accepted. If it's not accepted, then we have a premise that none of what he says can possibly be true. Yet I have heard the exact same things, maybe not to such depth, but I've heard the exact same things from countless people who have very deep ties as Russians, including a friend of mine who lived in the United States for many, many years, raised family there and came back, now lives here in Moscow. And for him, this stuff is really important. This is very, very important to him, so much so that I cannot understand it. And so I cannot be the only one that doesn't understand it, but there are probably a lot of Americans who have no particular cultural reference points and don't really think about it very much and don't really respond to it very much. And so when they run into a strong ethnic culture like Russian or Greek or Syrian Arab or something like that, you're gonna start running into these elements that we never acquired in our lives. So the discussion went on for quite a long time, and then it went on into talking about China as power and the world, the power structure. And President Putin started to talk about the inevitability of change in the world and how and how the structure in the United States, not really the political structure, he couldn't even define it himself, that sometimes the president or the leader of the United States has the power to make some decisions about what the country is going to do, but sometimes he doesn't, and he mentioned that. He also talked about something that I find, I understand it's very common among regular Russian people. They do not understand the American electoral system. You know, Russia, for example, has national elections. So the winner of the election is carried by popular vote. Now, there's certainly, you know, for president and all that kind of stuff. So they don't understand that the United States does not do a national election. It does 50 state elections, and those state elections help determine what the voting pattern for the Electoral College will be, and the Electoral College picks the president. We understand it, but they don't. They don't understand how this can be or why. And I've had that happen a lot of times in talking with my students and with friends here, that they don't understand it. And even when I explain it to them, they take it at face value, but I don't think they really understand it. They see it as whoever loses the election often sees it. Well, why don't you just do a national vote? And I always have to explain, well, the founding fathers understood that there is disparity, you know, power between large, heavily populated areas and lightly populated areas. And this was a way to try to equalize that. So one very amusing point was when Tucker asked President Putin point blank, who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? And President Putin looked at him with a straight face and said, you did. And Tucker took it in good stride. He said, oh, no, I was busy that day. I didn't have time to blow anything up. It was very amusing. Very good thing. The rapport in the conversation was good. I think that this will get us into the second part of this interview, but not before I say one thing. The last part of the interview, President Putin talked about Orthodox Christianity as a formative force, but also about all of the religious identities in the Russian Federation, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, as the other three of the four nationally recognized religions, Orthodox Christianity being by far the first and largest in scope. But he also talked about this as being very, very vital to the way people view themselves and their homeland. And he pointed out that for the Russian, he said about the Americans, he says, you guys in America, the Westerners, are pragmatic, very pragmatic. We aren't. We think we have a tendency to think more about the eternal. And and also the idea of, supporting and preserving the values of the motherland is very important to preserving one's own personal well-being in the motherland. And this is something that I noticed too. A few weeks ago, I became a Russian citizen. And when this happened, it was very unceremonious. I didn't even, right or wrong, I didn't say the oath. They gave me a printed oath and I signed it, and it was all in Russian. But I was really interested in it, and I wanted to say it, and it just, the folks, I guess, thought it was enough for me to sign it because I'm signing my agreement to it. I knew what it said. And I ran it through a thorough translation, and it says this, it says something about that I will defend the cultures and traditions and the history of the Russian Federation. And I thought this was very interesting because what it's saying is this stuff matters. Now, let's compare that to what we think as Americans in our day. Do we think our culture and our history and our traditions matter? And I think for some of us, the answer is yes. And for some of us, the answer is what? What are you talking about? I think, and that kind of defines a large part of the problem that we face in the United States. And it is fertile ground for propagandists within the United States and within the West overall to work. This problem, I believe, also exists in Western Europe, which even though there are certainly local cultural traditions, one of the things that seems to have been beat out of a lot of the people there is religious adherence. The churches are there. They're not tearing the churches down, but the churches are not being used, or they are only being used rather ceremonial in many cases. And whatever a Christian church teaches, for the few people that actually go to a service, maybe those people pay attention because they're in the church, but then there are a great number of people that will point with great joy and great admiration towards the beautiful architectural work of their country, with such and such cathedral and all that kind of stuff. But if they are asked if they actually ever attend services there, the answer will be no. And why would we do that? We've moved beyond that. Now it's just a cultural artifact. And so President Putin was kind of pointing out that this is really not the case in Russia. And he is right. I wouldn't say that everybody is packing the temples in Russia. That would be incorrect. But, even if only a few percentages of people are doing that, those people who are doing it are generally respected by the rest of the people for the fact that they are doing it. And even the people that are not doing it, often you can hear them speaking to one another using terms that the church itself uses as well. Even, for example, the Russian word for thank you, spasibo, is taken from spasi Bog, save and protect us, O Lord, something like this. So spasi is sakrani. And so this is, save and protect. The root words never, in some cases, never moved away from the church language. And some of the spiritual meaning carries. And so this happens in many places in the Russian language. And language shapes thought, shapes soul, and so on. And there you go. So now to the second part. The propagandizing efforts that began in the West and that are likely to amplify, I think, as the result of this interview. Before the interview was aired, the propaganda, that the narrative line that I heard several people on several different YouTube broadcasts talk about was, no matter what Putin says, it's going to be propaganda. Okay? Even from people that were trying to be fair. They were starting out trying to be fair while being unfair, because this way of saying things is carrying the natural assumption that no matter what President Putin says, he is lying, and he is lying because he is President Putin, and the definition of President Putin is a liar. And I've seen a lot of this kind of thing. I did a piece a few days ago about how my conversation with people in the chat associated with the news of the oncoming interview was greeted on Newsweek by people talking about how Russia is communist, President Putin is communist, I am a communist. And it didn't matter what I said, especially to this particular person who said, communism is gone. It's not been, there certainly is a communist party of the Russian Federation. I've seen them. They aren't very big. They walk around with Soviet-era flags and stuff like that. They're very quiet. And basically nobody pays any attention to them. A lot of them are quite young because they are often influenced by liberal ideas coming from Europe, which are very far to the left. So hence they hear all of this stuff about what communism is supposed to promise, equal pay, equal protection for everybody, all this kind of stuff. And just like any good old American lefty, they think that that is the way to go, so they're attracted to the KPRF, whatever. And some of the other constituents of this party are often very old people who remember the Soviet Union and miss it because even though, maybe they had good lives under it and, reasonable lives, but the thing that I often hear people talk about who remember it is they miss the stability. And they, as compare the comparative, the comparison they make about stable compared to what is the time after the Soviet Union fell, the early and mid-90s, and the time before President Putin came to power, when money was wildly fluctuating and often worthless. People were not paid for months at a time for their jobs because nobody had money. Nobody had money to pay. There were bread lines. President Bush was, I believe it was George W., was known around Russia for sending gigantic chickens to Russia as food because there was a food shortage. There was a major food shortage. The era surrounding Mikhail Gorbachev, who Americans, including myself for a long time, really admired because we thought he was bringing freedom to Russia. Well, maybe he was, but the buildings that were put up during his time in office reveal a very different story. They are still standing. There are these heavy concrete apartments, and they're super, super ugly. They may stand through an earthquake or through multiple attacks, but they are miserable places because there was very little money in the Soviet Union at that time to build anything better. So because of that, the general legacy of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Russian Federation nowadays is he is not appreciated. Not appreciated at all. And that might come as a surprise in the West. So the narrative is, okay, everything President Putin says is going to be propaganda. Well, now the interview is out. So what is going to happen? He talked about history, so I can expect to hear things like his skewed version of history, his fantasies, all of this kind of stuff. And you're going to hear, I bet you hear a lot of that. And you're going to probably hear a lot of it from conservative commentators as much as you're going to hear it from liberal commentators. And the reason is very simple. In the United States and in the West, there has been no less than 50 or 60 years of manufactured propaganda ideas about the Soviet Union. And that started to lighten in the United States when the Soviet Union fell, but it only started a little. You'll find movies from the 1990s like Crimson Tide and several other movies, even leading up into recently with the Marvel series of movies, where the relationship between the two countries is seen as fairly good, but that the Americans are undeniably in charge. Okay, that's how it's wanted to be perceived. Russia as weak, big, dangerous, and weak because it's nuclear armed, even though it's weak, and they need the United States' help in order just to survive because they just can't do it by themselves. And President Putin has upended all of that. when he started upending all of that, the propaganda and the pressure, in President Putin's own words, this pressure began again to try to keep Russia down. And President Putin even talked about how he went to President Bill Clinton when Bill Clinton was visiting Moscow, I believe it was, and President Putin said, "What do you think about, we need a security agreement. We should have a security agreement between Russia, Europe, America, Canada." And also he asked President Clinton point blank, how would it be possible for us to join NATO? And he talked about it, and President Clinton said, this is an interesting idea. Let me see about it. And this is more than I had ever heard of the story. This is what President Putin himself says. And then later that evening, they were supposed to have dinner, and President Clinton came back and said, "Look, I'm sorry, we can't do it. The time is not right for this." Well, who told him that? And so this is one of the big focuses where President Putin says that a lot of this focuses on the intelligence apparatus, of which he himself was a part of in the Soviet Union, with it being in the KGB, so he knows it. And he says, look, our job is to oppose each other. That's fine. I understand it. But there is this elitism that seems to control American political bodies at some times. And when it happens, the politician always caves in. And so he talked about that. There was nothing that I could see. Now, again, my view about this is colored by the fact that I've been living here for almost 9 years. And I've been interested in Russia for even a little bit longer than that, but I have been living here for almost 9 years. So to the extent that there might be any Kool-Aid for me to drink, can't find Kool-Aid in Russia, by the way. You might find something that's like it, but they don't sell it here. And I don't drink vodka. I don't drink alcohol at all. So maybe it's fructovi sok, multifructovi sok, multifruit juice. I don't know. I don't think I particularly bought into any propaganda lines. I am very aware of when something is propaganda and when it is not. Because I think, and I try to compare things to, surrounding context to get an idea of what's going on. And I didn't see any propaganda. If there is any criticism I might offer, this criticism is said in, it would have been nice if, but I also have to say that if President Putin or Tucker had done the things I'm about to say, it might not have helped at all. It might have made things worse. So these were just thoughts that I had. One was that when Tucker asked President Putin about some of the conversations he had had with people about various issues, such as the joining NATO thing, President Putin gave names and even compliments, towards some of the people, ambassadors and stuff. But he would not talk about what they said. He would go and say, look, I don't think it's right for me to say what they said. You go ask them. I think this is very diplomatic. It also runs the risk of Tucker going to those people and asking him, which he probably will do or try to do, and those people simply categorically denying that the conversation ever took place, or coming up with something that will sell to the American listeners and readers in such a way as to sustain the propaganda narrative, okay? Because that's what it's going to be all about for a while right now. The established media is going to try everything they can to prove that they're going to either ignore this interview or they're going to try to prove that it is wrong. And right now it's not very clear as to which route they're going to take. Tucker covered his bases very, very well. And if anything, I think he will be criticized for laughing when President Putin said that he himself blew up the line, and then Tucker made a joke and said, no, I was doing too many other things. I had no time to blow up the pipeline. He'll probably be roundly criticized for that because he's being too friendly to the Putin. All right, but I'm going to say this. If I were doing the interview, I would have laughed too. It's because it's funny. And because all of the criticism is not revolving around fact and information. It's revolving around the court of public opinion and what you're supposed to look like you're doing. The echo of the interview with Megyn Kelly that was given several years ago, where Megyn was acting like a prosecuting attorney, and she kept trying to nail the president on interference in the American elections. And anybody knowing Megyn Kelly also knew that she was not a particularly great fan of President Trump, and that's an understatement. And she was definitely, as working for Fox, which was really pursuing a very neocon angle in its news reporting, she was probably following the angle instructions as prescribed. Okay, now neocons don't exist only in conservative or pseudo-conservative networks. They are called neolibs, and they exist in lib networks. But neocon, neolib, it's basically the same thing. It's this idea that whatever is going on, anything Russia is by definition wrong because by definition it is wrong. A tautology. It's a logical fallacy, but it's a fallacy that has been reinforced with 50 or 60 years of solid and very misinforming propaganda in the United States about the Russian Federation, about its people, about its leadership, and all this. Criticism over President Putin's being in power for so long. It's too long. Somebody else should be there. Well, why? Why should somebody else be there? Well, because he's been there for too long. And why is that wrong? Well, because he's too powerful and he's corrupt. Well, how do you know that? I don't know that. And quite frankly, I don't really care, because he's doing a really good job for the country. He's doing a very good job for the Russian Federation. As he described himself, the Russian economy was the largest in Europe. It is the 5th largest economy in the world, even now while under sanctions. It is growing faster than the United States economy is growing, though I'm not really experiencing much of it myself because I haven't been able to find real work for quite a long time. But that's also because my work is very nichey, so, we'll see. We'll have to see how that goes. But apparently things are going really well. We're even getting along pretty well. Actually, we're making it. It's a little different than how we did before, just a little, but we're making it. So this whole notion of everything about Russia being wrong is just, it's a narrative that has eventually got to crack. And I think that this interview was a hammer blow, and probably a really big one. But like when you take a big sledgehammer and hit the concrete wall for the first time, you hit really hard and nothing seems to happen. And so you hit really hard again and again and again, and maybe cracks start to appear. So my final words on this. What happens next? Well, we don't really know. I know that Tucker has been invited to come and visit Crimea, and I don't know if he took up that offer or not. I hope he did. It would be very informative. But he also said that he asked President Zelensky of Ukraine also to give an interview, and he said in his preview video that he hoped that Mr. Zelensky would accept. I think what's going to happen is that Zelensky is not going to accept. But I'm going to give it almost even odds. And here's why. Zelensky is, the reason I think President Zelensky will not accept the interview, at least the reason he will use, is because Tucker interviewed President Putin first, and I don't want to talk to anybody who has interviewed that guy, which is very childish. But if you think about his particular decree that he signed a while back, that Ukraine would not enter into negotiations with Russia for peace while President Putin was in power, is also extraordinarily childish. And apparently, one of the little surprises in this interview is that apparently at one point, President Putin and Vladimir Zelensky were on very good terms with each other, because there was part in the interview where President Putin uses the diminutive of Vladimir, Volodya. Volodya. Volodya is, it's a diminutive name of Vladimir. They're both Volodymyr, Vladimir. It's the same name. It's just one is Ukrainized and the other one is Russian, but it's the same name. And so Volodya, oops, sorry about that. Volodya is a very familiar and very friendly term for one person to refer to another. If they were on bad terms, I don't think that President Putin would have gone to Mr. Zelensky and said Volodya. It would have been, with the first name and patronymic. Let me get that for you. Hold on. Let me pause. Okay, got it for you. Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky. So what would have happened if these two were really not on good terms with each other and on, very formal, very angry? It would have been probably Volodymyr Alexandrovich. Why are you doing this? This is a formal thing among Russian peoples. Also, too, keep in mind that Mr. Zelensky himself speaks Russian. He is not very good at speaking the Ukrainian variant of the language. He speaks Russian. So apparently they had a fairly friendly, cordial relationship going. President Putin also talked about how Zelensky won his election with the promise of bringing peace to Ukraine. And apparently, also further, Vladimir Putin seems to show a positive attitude that he had about Zelensky's election. He seemed to hope the best for him. So this bizarre tactic of I'm not going to let my country negotiate with Russia while Putin is in power seems to be very childish to me. Also, and probably we'll end this here. It was repeatedly stated in the interview, and this is interesting because it caught Tucker off guard, and I think for the same reason it catches a lot of us as Westerners off guard. Liberal culture has emasculated the person who is upholding what is right so badly that even Tucker Carlson asked a couple of times on the interview to Vladimir, don't you think it would be a good idea to call the White House and say, hey, let's talk? What would it be for you if you said to NATO, okay, congratulations, NATO, you won this one? And several other things like that. Statements that essentially are of capitulation to the other guy's terms when the other guy is the one that started doing the things wrong. President Putin was very interesting here because in each of these points, whenever he had an opportunity to talk about this kind of situation, and at the end of the interview, there was a lot of this, he reminded me of a strong parent, a good parent. When we've got a misbehaving child, you punish the child, you restrict him, you keep him from doing something, keep him from hurting himself, whatever. But the parent will say, you are the one causing the problem. I am here for you. When you want to stop causing the problem, then I will help you. And in so many respects, Ukraine's behavior, the decree that I just mentioned, the sanctions coming from the West being exerted on Russia to punish it, which only seem to be making Russia stronger, much stronger economically and every way else, much more independent, much more free. Everything the West is doing is like jumping up and down, like an enabling parent who has lost control. And President Putin appears to be very much in charge, saying, look, we didn't start it, and we are not going to change anything about what we are doing, but we are always open to negotiations. But we cannot start negotiations with some idea that we've got to apologize for something that we were doing. We were trying to stop this, not start it. And he very firmly showed that. Now, how will the viewers take it? Each according to their own biases, of course. I hope some of them are impressed enough to be moved to a more honest assessment of the situation, which I believe this interview is. That is my bias, but I am also a critical listener. And if somebody does something wrong, I will say it, and I don't care, because it's about right or wrong for me. It's not about the great Russian nation. It's not about the great American nation. I am a citizen of both. I want them both to get along together, but they can only do it if they're telling the truth to each other. And Russia is telling the truth at this point a lot more than the United States power structure is. And that's as simple as it is. And until it changes, then, President Putin is fine with doing what he's doing. He's doesn't really want to hurt anybody. He doesn't want to do anything wrong to anybody. He certainly doesn't want to take over Europe. He made that very clear and very pointedly. And so it's going to be for the Western world to see this, if they have the courage to hear it, to review it, to listen to it, to read it, and to think. And that's what I hope they do. That's what I hope they do. That's what I hope we all do. I will probably offer, it's likely I might offer some more commentary at some point, but I think that's all there is for now. So if you like this video and you think it's, especially, I want to ask all of you that listen to me, in case there is something that you think is important to you, share this with a friend, because it might be important to them also. Tucker Carlson did this because one of the things that motivates him is the desire to stop our two countries from going to an open war with each other. Russia is not going to do it. President Putin made that abundantly clear in his interview, and there's no reason for me, I don't think there's any reason for anybody to think that he would do anything else. I don't think he's lying. There's no reason for him to lie. But the Americans are crazy. The political elite in the United States are crazy. And if this interview hits us in that place where we can see that, then if it does that to you, if it does that for you, there might be other people that you know that are also in the dark. Send this to them. Get them to watch it. Get them to see it. It's important. Get them to see my video. Get them to watch the interview. It's 2 hours and 7 minutes long. It's on YouTube, so you can watch as much or as little of it as you want to. But it is extraordinarily important because it's the truth. It is the truth. And the truth, as we have been told by our Lord Jesus Christ, the truth will set you free. And with that, this is Seraphim Hanish, American in Exile, 1967 channel on YouTube, and with the Duran. So please like my work if you do. Please not like it if you don't. Subscribe if you can, if you want to, and share this with everybody that you can. It's not only for you, it's for everybody, for all of us. Take care.